This was the original Frankenstein hardware version, developed in the end of the 1990s, intended as a stereo enhancement circuit. It was called enhancement, which was probably a bad term actually. It should have been called stereo correction matrix. We'll look at some of the historical background to that. So here is a picture of Alan Dowler Blumlein, electronics genius, inventor of the cathode follower, amongst other things, and pretty much the inventor of the analog television system. Very sadly died in the Second World War developing radar, but in 1928 to 1932 he did a lot of experiments on what he called binaural sound, which was the basis of all stereo recording today. With his death, it fell to his team to develop the stereo system, the commercial stereo system, at the end of the 50s. And that team included Clark, Dutton and Vanderlyn. And they wrote a very famous paper calling it the Stereosonic recording and reproducing system. That really set the theoretical background to and explained in detail how a full stereo system from microphone to microgroove recording apparatus would work, and did work. In the process of developing the system, they did a lot of listening tests, and this was the configuration they used. So very familiar 30 degrees left, 30 degrees right loudspeakers, just as we use today. Slightly big listening room with 10 feet between the speakers, but very familiar from today. The essence of the EMI system, or Blumlein system one should say, is that the stereo was encoded purely by intensity ratio between the left and right channel. That's to say that if you wanted a sound to appear fully left, the left loudspeaker would be sounding and the right loudspeaker would be silent. But if you wanted the center, they would both be sounding, and if you wanted it partially left, the left loudspeaker would be stronger than the right loudspeaker. The sound would be louder coming out of the left-hand speaker than the right-hand speaker. But there wouldn't be any timing differences between the signals, and there wouldn't be any phase differences. So it's a relatively straightforward system where it is purely interchannel intensity ratio that sets the stereo position. And although it's quite simple electronically, it actually creates quite a complex situation psychophysically, which is why it's such a clever system. This paragraph is from the original Stereosonic paper, and I won't read it slavishly, but what it says is that below 700 Hertz in their subjective listening tests, they got very good correlation with the mathematical model that they put together. So they did a full model of how the system worked in terms of the intensities and how they added phases at the ears and whatnot. And that then produced a very good and solid theoretical model, which was tested in listening tests, and below 700 Hertz worked very well indeed. But above 700 Hertz, the model didn't predict where the percept, where the particular image would appear to subjectively. So in essence, we have a situation like this, that for instance, if they had a low frequency sound with a given ratio between the left and right speakers, it might appear there, for instance, but a high frequency sound with the same ratio would appear more exaggerated, wider if you like. So if it was towards the left for the low frequency sound, it would be more towards the left for the high frequency sound. If it was to the right for the low frequency sound, it would be more towards the right for the high frequency sound. And this is a composite of curves which I've plotted from various different researchers. The ones here are Clark, because he's the main author. And you can see here that on the bottom of the screen, which is the horizontal axis, we're looking at interchannel level difference, and the vertical axis we're looking at percentage of the stage width. So the biggest percentage obviously is 50%, because that's fully left or fully right. And so for a particular interchannel level difference, you can imagine drawing a line up from the bottom axis, and it crosses the blue line, which is his LF result, way before it crosses the HF. So the HF is wider, it's further out on the stage width for a given intensity ratio than the LF. Now if you look at them, Leakey was another researcher, and you can see exactly the same pattern there, and Vent is another researcher, and his pattern is even more strong. But they all show that high frequency has a much steeper curve than low frequency. The differences, incidentally, are due to the fact the differences in the way the tests were made and whether people were allowed to move their heads or not. So that's just a detail. But the important thing is that all researchers show that high frequency image is always wider than low frequency image. And this is an image which I put together to try and put some sort of analogy together with light. So here we have a picture with the red components, which are the low frequencies, which is narrower than the blue frequencies, which are the high frequencies, and the blue light, which is the high frequencies. And you can see this smearing effect, which is analogous in fact to chromatic aberration in a lens. And so the stereo system, based entirely on interchannel intensity ratios, has this smeared effect, has this aberration at low frequency and high frequency. Now, in no way did Clark, Dutton and Vanderlyn regard this smearing at high and low frequencies an acceptable compromise for their stereo system, and they set about a very clever way of compensating for it. And what they found is that if they derived a sum signal, that's left plus right, and a difference signal, that's left minus right, and then filtered the difference signal above 700 cycles per second, they could maintain perceptual register right across the frequency range. And they called this circuit a shuffler, because it was shuffling the stereo image slightly in relation to frequency. That was all well and good, and that is actually their circuit actually shown at the bottom of this slide. The left-hand part being the frequency dependent, that's the filter, the network. But having done that, they then had to matrix the signals back to left and right again, and they needed phase compensation to do that, which is what's happening in the right-hand part of that circuit. And we shall return to that, because that was the part that caused the problems later on. So they considered this shuffler as an indispensable part of the stereo system, and it was incorporated in the very famous Red 37 and Red 51 mixers, which were developed for EMI stereo recordings, studio recordings. The 51 is the one illustrated here. Sometimes that's called the Beatles mixer, because it was the mixer that was used to record all the significant Beatles records throughout their career. And in fact, this next quote actually comes from a document which is the user manual, or the manual for the Red 51 mixer. And it's got a very good explanation of the shuffler. And it says, the action of the shuffler can best be explained as follows. Suppose that an instrument is located halfway between the extreme left of the center. When notes of a very low frequency are played on this instrument, all is well. But when higher and higher notes are played, it appears to move out towards the left, just as I showed with the crosses earlier on. The shuffler counteracts this effect by taking a little of the higher frequency signals away from the left-hand channel and applying them to the right-hand channel. In this way, the apparent angle of the source is made to remain constant with increase in frequency. So that was what the shuffler did. It was a very ingenious system it was too. But when the mixers were scrapped unceremoniously at the end of the 60s, the red mixers, really the shufflers were lost forever and almost entirely forgotten. Or at least it was until Frankenstein rediscovered it in the end of the 90s, and I took some of those ideas and put them back into a different circuit configuration. The difference with Frankenstein isn't what it did, it was the way it did it. So what Frankenstein did was use a crosstalk mechanism, a relatively straightforward crosstalk mechanism, to achieve exactly the same effect that the EMI shufflers had done, with the difference that by doing it via crosstalk, it was impossible to create any kind of audio coloration. You weren't trying to derive things, matrix things, filter them and rematrix them, which was a fairly fraught methodology, whereas Frankenstein used a crosstalk methodology which was transparent.